So I'd like to call this work session to order. Our first item this afternoon is our building code updates and discussion. Our building official, Samantha.
Good evening.
How are you?
Not too bad. So I'm here tonight. There's a bunch of code changes, and I wanted to go through them so that if you guys had any questions before we started trying to change our code to adapt to these, that we could get those addressed as we go through. So I put together a quick presentation, and I went through each of the line items so that you would have an idea of where it's addressed at now and how it might affect us. So the first one, this one is, it allows for more flexibility in bringing the dangerous building code in. It allows us to kind of phase in seismic rehabilitation if we want to do that. We're currently redoing the dangerous building code, so this is one of the things we're going to look at as we redo that code section if we want to kind of adapt this in there, and that would be where we would regulate this one. Abatement of nuisance and dangerous buildings. That's obviously our dangerous building code, and that's the one we're redoing.
And I forgot to say that Lisa Beatty is actually in attendance on the phone.
Yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Lisa.
She's in cold country, isn't she? She's over in the East Coast.
New Hampshire.
Ooh,
It's cold here.
fun.
It's cold here.
Fire safety
Isn't that
during
where the
construction.
candidates are now?
It's currently regulated in the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, but that's something that Clackamas County Fire will be taking over, so that's not something that we need to regulate locally. They'll take care of that aspect of this one. Number 4, demolition. So demolitions aren't covered specifically in our code. I guess we don't care if they tear things down, but we do. So we want to put that back into our code locally so that we can require permits and make sure that things are done correctly for capping off sewers and that type of thing.
So when there's something not in our code, but it should be in there, so what do? Look at best practices on that, or is there something specific that's written that we need to that you'll put in that we just need to adopt, or?
Well, the demos currently are listed in our scope of the MMC, and so I think we could get there, and we have been require permits for demos so that we can make sure that things are done correctly. A lot of times it's more for tracking, so that we can tell this one gets an SDC credit because they tore down a brand new house. If we don't have that on record, then a lot of times there's no way to track what happened with this site.
Yeah.
So, and that's more, we had one where they were demoing a underground tank, and there really isn't anything I need to look at, but if you look back in 15 years and you had a gas station there, you want to make sure that at some point those tanks came out.
Right.
So it's record keeping more than anything else there.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Protection of adjoining property. I talked to engineering with this one because it's very vague. For brand new houses, we have things in place now in our code. We have engineering does a review for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. It's to make sure all of their rainwater stays on site and that type of thing. Erosion control does an inspection and does a plan review to make sure all of the stuff stays on site. So we do it during the construction phase, but after the fact, it's a civil issue, and we really don't address that. But the way they kind of put this in there, it's very vague on what this opens up. So,
Sam, could you use this for solar protection laws?
I use it for.
So if somebody puts solar panels on their house and the neighboring property is going to block the sunlight, could you use this for solar protection laws?
We might be able to.
Okay.
I mean, it opens it up, protection of adjoining property,
Okay.
line of sight type of thing. We don't have anything now that addresses any type of line of sight in our code, besides the waterways. We have some type of vague stuff in there for waterways, but we probably could if we wanted to address that somehow in here.
Does this touch on demo? So if they're, tearing down a house with a big yellow machine as opposed to handwork, and it's full of asbestos and lead paint and all of that, and the wind's blowing and all that stuff is blowing over to the neighbor's property.
It does not. I'm not sure how we would address that. It becomes a civil issue if there's anything going on. We require erosion on there, but we don't, even in the building code, we don't require anything for abatement. That's all done through DEQ and other agencies. They don't require any type of anything from the building code for demos on abatement.
That's interesting because the city of Portland got serious about asbestos abatement in their older buildings, and I think part of that, along with just a greater ecological sensitivity, is that they did put into their code a whole bunch of stuff about if your house is X number of years old, it has to be dismantled by hand, and you must reuse as much of the material as you can, and you must properly dispose of the asbestos we know is in there because it was built before, before 1970, I think, is basically your
cutoff, yeah.
Your cutoff. So,
and that could be something that we could address here, some type of measures to put in there. Yeah, we could.
I suspect we're going to be seeing more demos.
Yeah, either that or remodels, especially with the new House bill that passed where they can convert single families into duplex, triplex. I think we'll see a lot of conversions and partial demos, but yeah.
things to think about. Yeah, it might be cool to just look at some of that code that Portland put together. I know that then turns into another thing that must be enforced, and that there's problems there for us.
It'd be interesting to see how they handle it, though, and how they handle the enforcement portion of it, rather than just, sometimes you can require things, and it's like we require moisture content less than 19%. The way the state deals with that is they sign a letter saying that it was less than 19% at framing.
Right, yeah.
So, sometimes
Don't actually go out and test it.
No. That's what the state decided we would accept as a letter, which they turn in with their application when they apply for the permit.
Sometimes I miss the days when I knew so much less.
Temporary use of streets and alleys. This one was taken out of the building code, but we regulate it in MMC Title 12 through our engineering department, so it was not one of those things we needed to address. Encroachments into the public right-of-way, same thing. We have a process in place where we regulate those through MMC 12.14. Retaining walls that do not support a building right now are exempt from our code. We can't require permits for it. This now allows us to put that in our code where we can require permits for those retaining walls that aren't specifically supporting the buildings, which we've had kind of a gap in our process the last couple of years, because at one point BCD had said you can't do it, and not only can you not do it, you also cannot put it in your municipal code to regulate it. So now they've kind of gone back and said now you can. So the old code language said for retaining walls over 4 feet in height or retaining a surcharge, so the ground comes out this way, that would be my recommendation of where we go to, because the little planter box things we really don't care about. So anything 4 feet or high or retaining that surcharge, I think, is where we'd want to go for this. So.
Excuse me, Sam, so this is in addition to anything that would be in the right-of-way, correct?
Engineering regulates anything in the right-of-way. So I can't regulate anything in the right-of-way, and I think engineering does have a process now for anything that retains a street and anything in the right-of-way that they would regulate, yeah.
It retains a yard.
Yeah, retains the yard that's in the right-of-way.
Yeah.
Typically, if it's retaining the yard, it should be on property. I know we have some funky
be.
Property lines.
Often is not, including
be.
most of my street, including my own house.
And that would actually be regulated by engineering. I mean, if it is in the right-of-way, it would be an encroachment, and I think we've gone through that process where it's an encroachment into the right-of-way, and it would be through engineering. So we still would require a permit.
Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, we've got tons of stuff all over town that's grandfathered or whatever, and I mean, we're going to see a lot of that when we get to working on Monroe, for example. But I guess I'm thinking about new retaining walls. So if they're and some of those that Kathy's mentioning are definitely more than 4 feet. So if they're in the right of way, that's one kind of regulation, and if they're in your property but they're more than 4 feet, they would be regulated under what you're proposing.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Fences. We regulate it currently in the building code if it's over 7 feet. Right now, they're exempt under 7 feet. And then through MMC, planning regulates it. But they don't allow them over 8 feet, so really it's for a foot that we kind of require permits. I did talk to planning today, and you can go through a type 3 variance to try to get a fence over 8 feet, but it's just very, very rare. So we can put this back in there and require the permits, but it just is not used very often.
Yeah.
So.
Just to clarify, I thought, if the back or side of property, 8 feet might be right, or 7 feet, but isn't the front of property where we're finding issues?
Right, for planning, yes. So the planning, and I can't recall off the top of my head, I want to say 4 feet, but it may be 6 feet in the front of the property, but that's regulated through MMC 8.04.130. But even if it's less than 7 feet, my code has never required a permit for it anyway, so it's regulated through planning, the size of it in the front yard.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
So your numbering is different than the numbering here, and one of the things I had questions about that we are theoretically past is like utility tower, cell tower kinds of things.
Okay, so I do have that in here. I went off, I think, the second, because there's the list that they exempted everything, and then the second list is what I have the power to regulate.
Got
And
it.
there was a few things that they took out of that first list
Yeah.
that they say I just,
Pages.
Okay,
Line up,
I got it. I see. Okay.
okay. So tanks is another one that are located exterior to and not attached or supported by a regular building. These are propane tanks, oil tanks. What we typically look at in building is the seismic portion. We just don't want it rolling off down the street if something happens. So that would be another one we'd have to put back into our code to regulate.
How about cisterns or, runoff, like if you've got a, sorry, I have no words today.
Rain barrels.
Rain barrels, like a really big rain barrel.
That's exactly what
Rain barrels.
my inspector said. Rain barrel, we could secure them. We don't get very many of them, but this would actually fall into that too if they got to a certain size where they would be considered a tank.
Okay.
What is that size? What's the definition?
It doesn't regulate, so it would be something that we would need to, anything over 20 gallons or anything over, something 10 gallons or whatever we,
Probably
50
over
gallon.
50 gallons,
50 is
yeah.
normal barrel.
Barrel, yeah. So once you get up to probably about the 100 gallon is when you're looking at for rain barrels, that's when you're going to get a
Into
little,
cistern
Yeah.
world. Yeah, okay.
yep.
And then there we go.
And then cellular, yep.
Cellular.
The reasoning they took this one out of our code is what I found out was that they had an inspector out in Eastern Oregon that drove 2 hours and then another 45 minutes on a four-wheeler to get up to the cell tower inspection. And he's like, don't need to look at it when it's out in the middle of the boondocks. That's different when you're in the middle of Milwaukee, where if something falls over, it could really hurt some people.
Yeah.
So this would be one that I would most definitely recommend that we put back in and regulate in some way, shape, or form.
Yes, and I think when we're doing that, to be thinking about the new cellular system where we're going to have one of those things every block.
5G.
5G. That was one. I always want to go to 6G, and then so.
Yep, yes, and they are, and they can be atrocious. But
Yeah.
definitely we want to regulate it, so.
Yeah.
Flagpoles is one where we don't get that many of them. They can fall and hurt people, so we probably want to put them back in so that we have some type of, and it's, again, we usually go off the fence thing. If they're not over the 7 feet, we don't care if they're a smaller one. Once they get up to 20 feet, then we start caring that they might hurt somebody if something happens. Signs, they took signs out. We have an internal policy for wall signs that if it's less than 35 pounds, we don't require a permit for it. So we only, once they get past a certain weight, we want to make sure that they're going to stay attached to the wall, not come down on somebody's head. And then monument signs, we have gone with the retaining wall thing, and if it's less than 4 feet in height for a monument sign, we don't look at that one either. So, but pole signs, any of those big ones that could,
Or the way this reads, billboards.
billboards, exactly,
Yeah, I was
yep.
just going to ask about billboards.
Billboards would fit back in here also? Yeah.
I remember when we had the discussion about billboards on top of
Building.
buildings and restricting the size of them, but that's all that I recall that we did, was just.
I would think that the size and the location is usually through our planning code, through the MMC code. And then how it's attached and how it's going to stay safe is my code. So
Okay.
the location and size would be through our Title 14.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I just remember that was basically what we talked about, was where they were going to be and what size they were going to be, not
Yeah, because we had the one that went in
how they could
for
be secure or,
Bob's
be
Red
safe.
Mill. Yeah. They had a great bit, well, it wasn't, it's Bob's Red Mill sign, but same
Right.
concept. I mean, it was huge.
Yeah.
Floating structures. So this is not regulated currently by our code. I did some research because when I came from Oregon City and we had a floating code structure or code there. So I have examples from Oregon City, St. Helens, and Portland on how they regulate them. I did not know. I put definitions in here because had never heard the term a liveaboard before. The liveaboards are the ones you actually moor and stay in.
It's like houseboats.
Right. The only one we really have would be Willamette, I think, where we would have those. I talked to the state on their process because they own the waterways. What the state does is they make them get a permit to be on the waterway, but how it's connected, how it's built, all of that would be regulated by the city that they're mooring to. So this would be one, and my question to council is, do we want to regulate? Do we want to put some code in here in case we get any of these? I don't know what the likelihood of that is, but if we have something in here, then if we do have somebody that proposes something, we would have something in there to regulate it with, because right now we don't.
Right, well, I mean, I think there's more than one question there, right? Just docks in general and
Yeah,
the
there's-
floating structures of docks and how
would they
we
do that?
regulate that, because they,
Yeah, I have the next two are the same thing. It's the docks and the wharves and piers.
Yeah.
Which I didn't know the definitions of wharves and piers, so I looked that up because I didn't know what the difference between the two were. So, but yes, that would be, all three of those are kind of in that same boat, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
and we should probably have regulations, right? I mean, we've got a lot of different possibilities. As a frog ferry is very likely to come. For me, a personal peeve is all these docks that are basically made out of styrofoam. And then there's a little bit of a storm and a couple logs float down the river, and all of a sudden we have tons of styrofoam floating down the river.
Yep. Okay.
I think if we can make that not happen, that's a good thing.
Okay.
Well, and we've also got the wake boats that are causing increased bank erosion
Yeah.
and damage, so there's more perils out there for these
Yep.
structures in the city.
So,
Okay. All right. Staff will put together a code to come back to you guys with. Equipment shelters. So Currently, the commercial code exempts anything under 120 square feet, so we don't have to have permits for 120 square feet. So this one would exempt them up to 250 for just those equipment shelters. So like the Max has some of those equipment shelters right there. We had to require permits for those when they put those in. This would exempt those. It's one of those things where it's a little shelter. If we want to regulate it, we can. If we want to leave it the way it is, I kind of left it up to you guys.
I mean, I guess I don't know how this would, how does this interact with ADUs? I guess it's just a very clear, we know that it's being built for a specific purpose, and therefore we don't have to worry about that.
Right. Well, an ADU is accessory dwelling unit.
Right.
And those are regulated out of the residential code, which is
Right.
separate from this.
Right.
But yes, this one is specific to just equipment shelters. So just those things that house equipment. It wouldn't be any type of living anything because they have different requirements with them. The ones that we have now that are exempt under the 120 are tool sheds, that type
Right.
of use,
Right.
where it's not an intense use. It's nobody should be living there. So yeah, this one, it's just giving them a little bit more leeway because some of the equipment we have for like Amtrak or whatever, that won't fit in the 120. So this is giving them a little bit more leeway, same use.
Yeah.
So
Okay, I guess I mean, we've talked about regulating flagpoles because they might fall down and hurt somebody. Obviously, a structure that's 250 square feet would potentially do just as much harm as or more as a flagpole. So, I think before we get too, I guess we just, I would expect us to have some sort of level of consistency here, whichever way we go. I mean, if we're not going to regulate this, then I don't see us regulating a flagpole. So let's.
and I'm okay with either.
I'm looking at my
Yes.
counselors here.
Yes.
Like, let's actually have a conversation about this.
That's fair.
That really makes good sense. We go one way, but then on the other, it's like, oh yeah, well, if that building falls down.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I mean, if we're going to start regulating flagpoles, we're going to have a bunch of people in here really pretty
Yeah.
ticked off at us that we're regulating flagpoles and not their neighbor's structure that could fall down and kill their kid.
Well,
But that's not, again, this is just.
commercial code.
As I understand it, this is the kind of thing that ODOT would have put in, or PGE would put in, or one of
We
the
put in.
cell companies, or us would put in, that holds a bunch of electronic stuff, or maybe a pump, or a thing that
Household
has to be.
or-
Sure, but it could be next door to a residential property. It could be, I mean, it could still pose just as much of a problem as a flagpole.
Yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with
And
you.
that's
I'm
almost
just
an attractive
trying to
nuisance.
separate it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the more usual thing, I mean, all those things the mayor just rattled off are potentials, but it seems to me the more usual thing is people's sheds in their backyard, right?
But
And that's certainly what we focused on in the,
We're not
in setting that 120-foot,
Yeah.
20-square-foot, sort of exception. What happens now? I mean, I would think that we've had cases where some of those, we hear, someone's converted to sleeping. I mean, is that a code enforcement issue? What happens now?
It is, yes. So these aren't residential, though. These are strictly equipment shelters for commercial properties. The exemption for residential is 200 square feet used for a playhouse, a shed, that type of thing. If we get people sleeping in them, then yes, Tim and I pay a site visit.
Okay.
So,
I didn't understand this was commercial here. Okay.
Yeah.
All of these it's the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, which is the commercial entity, and then we have the Oregon Residential Specialty Code, which regulates everything single family and duplex related.
that's
Okay.
an interesting thing. So when you get into docks, is that
Yeah,
typically docks for houseboats?
yes.
Is that residential?
Yes. They are, but usually you have, it's not regulated in the residential code either because it's a floating structure, so that's,
Right.
you usually have a whole separate, yeah, I know.
So I agree. I always assumed there was some kind of code around how those things are built. They always seem to be built very well, these equipment
Shelters.
shelters.
I mean, they're usually built to house fairly
Expensive
expensive equipment.
So they make them very
Yeah.
non-break-inable.
Yes. Yes.
Probably a better word for that.
They're not going to fall down in a windstorm.
No, but
No, they want to protect their
it
equipment.
probably does need to be some kind of,
Yeah, but I agree with the consistency
Simple.
part of it, but it's like, so maybe we need to not regulate flagpoles.
That's kind of where I'm
Right,
leaning,
yeah.
actually. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
I can do that. I can leave the flagpoles out. That's what council wants. We don't get that many, honestly.
Yeah, I
I
just
don't think in the
many
5 years
fall
I've been
over
here,
and
I've
get
ever had somebody apply for a flagpole, but
I just don't
they're
have
usually in residential.
strong feelings about
yeah,
it.
And I worry more about the residential because they're usually
do it
not a
yourselfers.
contractor. It's a homeowner doing it
Right.
themselves.
Right.
Yes, and then I don't think about anchoring and things like
Yeah.
that.
Well, so a flagpole, to me, I also think about, like, Rotary's putting up peace poles, not a whole lot of difference, and,
Yeah, but those are at most,
Plastic and 6 feet tall.
right.
yeah, they're a little taller than that, but still, I mean, a flagpole could be the same thing, and so why would you, I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of thinking.
how about a flagpole of a certain height?
Yeah.
Well, that's kind
I think
of,
there is a
Yeah, that's in there.
Is there a
exemption
height
up to,
differential
is it
in
7
there?
feet? or-
The fences are 7 feet, so it's usually anything over,
Yeah, I'm saying we wouldn't regulate it until it gets to be
Gets
A
super
certain-
tall.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
it's,
I'm not thinking 7 feet, I'm thinking more like the one that you would see like a big car
Harley-Davidson.
dealer put up or something like
the
that.
Harley Davidson one that has and that's what they're looking at, is sometimes those flags are, they weigh
Have a serious
150
wind load.
pounds. Yeah, and they've got a serious
Like
wind
that
load on
should've
them.
just
in the
And if that one came loose, you'd have it all over 205, where
Yes.
it could, if we had one at Milwaukee Marketplace, you get it on 224, that could be,
Yeah.
so, yeah, and we can come back with, anything
Right.
over 20 feet tall and the flag weighing more than,
Yeah.
or
put some regulations on it so that it's
square
not.
footage of flag, maybe more than weight.
Yes,
I think
yeah.
the wind load is your scary thing, not your,
Right,
Yeah.
yes, yes, okay.
Somebody's car gets wrapped in a flag, I mean,
Well, we stopped for geese,
So the next one, administration of flood,
the floodplain.
I'm interested in that.
We regulate it currently through our MMC, engineering does. He's the floodplain manager.
Let's explore that more.
Okay? Want me-
already addressed, so are you suggesting that we need more in there? or
I don't
let's
know,
find out
I'd
what's
want to
there
see
and-
what's there and,
Yeah, okay.
yes.
Okay, I will pass that information on to Steve and let
'Cause I
him
think
pick
it-
that up.
It could touch on something we're going to see next, which is our discussion about floodplain code options, where we have our hands tied to some degree. So if there's a backdoor way to address the same problem,
Okay. And then transitional housing, and we're currently working on that, and we plan to bring that back because it's a whole kettle of fish all by itself. So I'll bring that back at a later date when we
cool.
fleshed it out more, so. So we have two kind of options that I see, and I've been working with Justin on which way to go. We can adopt the 2014 Chapter 1 in its entirety, and that would get all of these things back into our code if we adopted it that way. But when I was doing research for this, under MMC 15.04.170, we actually list every one of our codes that we currently recognize as adopted in Milwaukee. And I'm thinking that if we go under the structural code, we can list those things that we want to bring back in here with the limitations visitations and that type of thing and take care of it there. And then we wouldn't have this chapter from 2014 that we would have to maybe update or come back and do something else with. So that's more where I'm leaning towards now after doing that. But we got to figure out how exactly to word that so that we pick up what we really want to do and don't miss anything. So, but that would be where I'm leaning. So.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Nope, we're good? All right.
Did any of this touch on the whole use of shipping containers, commercial instances?
It doesn't. The shipping containers are, anything over the 120 square feet for commercial right now is required to have a permit. The only thing we look at is anchorage. We just want to make sure that they're not gonna, and most of them are so heavy, it's more in a floating situation, that they're not gonna float off down the thing. So just simple, I just actually did an inspection before I came here on Monroe. No, Morris. And he just used some wires, drilled them into the concrete to attach that down so that there isn't any possibility of it going any place in case we have any issues. So, and that's the only thing we require for those, for a commercial entity. We have them where people want to live with them in them for the residential end of
Different
things,
thing,
and that's
yeah.
a whole other kettle of worms. So, all right,
Cool. Thank you. Good job.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam.
Thank you.
All right. Our next item, as was mentioned, is the floodplain code, and that's going to be tag teamed by Denny Egner and Steve Adams.
I don't know if Steve's going to need to come up or not. I have some maps for you guys.
Handouts?
Depends on your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You don't have a PowerPoint, do you, Danny?
I do.
Oh, yeah, he did.
I have more than a PowerPoint, though. I have maps, too.
Okay, well,
But,
there you go.
okay. I will end up fumbling around a little bit as I pull up a couple of maps. They're not embedded into the PowerPoint, which is, in fact, very short. So, Denny Egner here today to talk about floodplain regulations. And I wanted to ask for a little bit of feedback on a couple of options that we've developed to see where we might head on this. And the reason for that is there are a couple things that are going on right now. One is we are working on the comprehensive plan, as you know, and there are a couple of proposed policies that relate to this topic. In addition to that, a project that the engineering department's been working on since last summer is an audit of Title 18, the floodplain requirements. And that was a project that DLCD, Department of Land Conservation and Development, approached the city and asked if we would be interested in participating in this audit. DLCD had gotten a grant from FEMA to work with cities who hadn't had their codes updated in a long time. So that process worked through the fall, and staff had actually developed a draft set of code amendments that they are basically ready to bring before the Planning Commission and Council. And as staff reviewed those, we were recognizing that we have a potential conflict with the policy language that we're developing in the comp plan, and felt that it was timely to come to council and have a discussion about this. So moving on to that policy, the key policy, this is one of the draft policies that I had in the staff report, but it's the one that I think is essentially the most problematic, if problematic is the right word to use. The language in the policy is to restrict development to uses that have a demonstrated community benefit and for which the natural hazard risks and environmental impacts can be adequately mitigated. So if I were to interpret this, and I think based on some of the discussion at the CPAC and perhaps at Council and Planning Commission when these were pinned down, the concept here was just an overall concern about inappropriate development in areas that flood for a couple of reasons. One being the risk to that development, but also the increased hazard for other properties as water's displaced. So this policy has some discretion built into it in terms of what do we mean by demonstrated community benefit. I think that's less, and then there's sort of known mitigation techniques. They're built into our code about cut and fill and raising development up higher. So that's not the problematic part. But I think it was that restrict uses that have a demonstrated community benefit. We suggested to the Planning Commission just last week, when they looked at this particular policy, that they might consider substituting the word or for and. They rejected that concept and said that they believe that we should be doing more to restrict development, but they also pointed out that fact that there is some discretion involved in this demonstrated community benefit. Could that mean a residential development with a trail along the water? Potentially, but we haven't defined that yet. So anyway, I think that you will be seeing this policy coming before you. It is, I think the Planning Commission has pinned it down at this point, but it's something to consider as we go forward. So why are we sort of concerned, and what are some of the options? We've looked at, in the staff report, we proposed 4 options to explore further. One's to modify that plan policy and go forward and adopt the Title 18 amendments that bring our code closer into conformance with the FEMA requirements. And for the most part, those are not substantive changes. For the most part, they are just technical, trying to clear up things that are confusing, and so on. But they don't do any more to really protect property.
Or to discourage building in bad places.
Or to discourage building in the floodplain.
Yes.
The next thought was to modify that plan policy slightly, but to build in higher standards into our Title 18 proposal, which would do something to protect new development and keep it safer by building it higher, perhaps, but it doesn't do anything in terms of mitigating for displacing that water
Which
necessarily.
is really the bigger problem.
The third option that, and we have not explored any of these options in much detail. We wanted to have a general discussion with you. The third option was to support that policy, that draft policy amendment, and amend Title 18 to actually do that, restrict development in the floodplain, and talk about what we mean there in terms of having a community benefit. And the final option was one of support that policy, adopt Title 18 the way we've written it, and do more to explore how to use our current natural resources protections to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. I mean, that, and we just had very intense discussion about how that works with the Elk Rock Island project, and we found that we're potentially at some risk using that discretionary process for residential development, not so much with industrial or with commercial development, but when we have residential projects, we're supposed to provide a clear and objective path. Now, we could make some adjustments to the code to build that in to make sure that when that's happening, it provides that clear path for someone to build at the minimum density as far out of the floodplain as we can get them. And that's sort of what's being proposed now with the Elk Rock project, but they aren't building 12 units. They aren't proposing 12 units anymore. I have one more slide, and then I wanted to talk about the maps a little bit. So what are the issues with these different options? There are potential takings in these residential areas if we totally restrict development in them. And so there's a balancing act that we're going to need to sort out to how we don't fall into that trap, or we may be buying property.
Denny,
Yes.
when you say in the residential areas, wouldn't you have a takings concern in the industrial areas as well?
I did say residential. It could be any of the
Okay,
zones,
thanks.
though. Thank you for catching that. Depending on, I think, whatever choice we make in terms of adopting the Title 18 provisions, there is a Measure 56 notice that would potentially come into play. And that's that notice that you send to property owners when you are potentially taking some right away, some development right away. That then adds a high level of complexity to all this, a lot more discussion, a lot more effort. And then finally, what I mentioned before is, regardless of what we do, we've got to build in that clear and objective path for residential development. So those are the issues that we've got to deal with. That's my presentation, other than we've got a couple resources available to look at, and I had provided you with with hard copies of some maps that Mary prepared, and I have those in a PDF that I can pull up on the screen if there's a way to do that. I need help.
Drag it.
Okay, so if I drive now, I'm up here, right? Okay. So
No one X out of that bar on the bottom. Yeah.
that guy right there.
Yeah.
So we have 4 maps that, one for residential, one for open space, one for commercial, and one for industrial. And they were done based on the plan designations. And what we did was look at each property that has some floodplain on it, map that entire property, and then showed where the floodplain is. Interestingly, the
Here we go. Yeah, if you could scroll down just a tiny bit. That would-
Yes.
scroll
There
down
we
to
go.
there.
Yeah.
We
Thanks.
lose a little on the top, but that's okay. I wanted to zoom in, though, is what I really
Okay.
wanted to do. And how do I slide over here, Scott?
Just grab it and pull it.
Yeah,
I can't drag it.
you can.
There's supposed to be a little bar somewhere that
Yeah.
I would move.
Scroll to,
There's a bar at the very bottom.
Any ideas? Well, I was going to zoom in down to Island Station, and I don't know how important it is to really zoom, because I think we can see what's going on there. Most of those properties are entirely
Right.
covered, but I can't slide it over. Oh, there you go, thanks. Where'd you find that?
When you put the mouse down there, it pops up.
Okay. So most of those properties are almost entirely covered in floodplain, whereas some of those properties off the Lake Road, the topography is such that the floodplain is much lower. It's right down along the water. And
Although I do have a question about one of those properties, but yeah, let's start with Island Station.
okay, and then up in this area, again, it's all the topography is such that those properties are so much higher.
Is that up in the Waverly area or below?
Yeah, in the Waverly area.
Gotcha.
Sorry, Denny, I missed the color coding. Can you explain that again?
The color coding here is that this is residential lots that have floodplain on them. The color coding is the 100-year floodplains in blue, and the other highlighted areas here are the rest of the lot. So, does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
You don't have a hard copy in front of you. Sorry.
I do not,
Yeah.
no.
So this is the residential map, and we've got some of up along Johnson Creek or up near our offices, there's some additional residential properties that are almost entirely covered by floodplain. Further along Johnson Creek, it's really it's again, the lower topography. But so it's just provides some examples of what's going on in the residential areas. So this map shows the open space designation. It's not creating big conflicts for us. It's just it's another comp plan designation that has floodplain zoning.
Can I ask a quick question? Go back, just down in that southeast corner above the park.
Russick Road.
Is that an island of not in the city, or?
Southeast corner,
You mean that thing that looks like a rope?
right here?
Right above the park.
So on the key, it says that dark line is the city boundary.
Yep.
And I can't make out, it looks to me like the city boundary creates an island.
This is an island. It is.
That's what, okay, it is an island.
Industrial area,
Okay.
there's an island. Now there's
Sure.
an island there.
Okay.
Just north of.
The Chirigino Farms
Park.
annexation.
Yeah.
But while you're down there in the park zone,
Yep.
so comparing the residential properties and then the open properties and sort of having a pretty good concept of what that topography looks like, I'm unclear why the, say, two or three properties south so go to the residential map, it'll be easier for me to explain it. So that one long, skinny property right next to the park, to the left, more to the west.
More to the west. This guy.
No,
No?
all the way, that is in the floodplain, that one.
That one. That's
Okay.
Chirigino Farms.
Right.
Right.
So then
Oh, the
there's
backside of
four
Cherokee.
properties to the south of that,
Right in
3 or
here.
4 properties.
Where
Yes, why are they not marked? Because the creek continues on
they're outside,
through.
they're not in the city.
They're in, yeah. We don't have them on our database.
We couldn't do anything about them.
Yeah, they would be floodplain also.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you, Denny. I didn't hear the response to the mayor's question.
It's
they're
outside of the
outside.
city limits. It's not that they're not in the floodplain, it's that they're outside of the city limits, so we don't care.
Well, we do care, but it's not,
Well, they're
it
in
doesn't
our.
show up on our map.
The reason I'm teasing, but the reason I'm pointing it out is because they are in our UGMA.
Right.
And if they're going to develop, they're going to develop in the city of Milwaukee.
Yeah.
So if we don't have it mapped, then we're not thinking about it when they develop in the city of Milwaukee.
We have the mapped information, and I imagine if I could have asked Mary to include that information when she made the maps, but I was just happy to get the
A map.
information in the city.
Matt, that's awesome. Good job, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
This is the commercial zoning that has floodplain, the wastewater treatment plant, our property at Coho Point, and the Moda property, or the commercials, the
And there's
commercial
nothing up
properties.
in the industrial?
No, these are
Oh,
commercial.
industrial is separate.
And the industrial is the last map. And
We know there's floodplain.
we knew this. We knew that there was floodplain issues here, but there are quite a few potential issues in the area south of Millport, all along Johnson Creek, and then up in the vicinity of along Johnson Creek
Yeah.
Boulevard.
Yeah.
Some of those are entirely covered in floodplain for Johnson Creek. So that's the overall.
And keeping in mind, this is the 1980 version of the 100-year floodplain.
That's absolutely correct. So,
Therefore, it's way worse in reality than what that looks like.
okay, I have one more thing that I wanted to pull up, and again, what do I do? I'm sorry, I'm inept at running this, but
Are you going back to the top?
I went. Yeah, I know. I'm out of the PowerPoint. I'm on the website. There we go. I really don't understand what you're doing there, but that's okay.
He's magic. Comes with a bow tie. You have to have a bow tie to make that work.
That's right. I think I might
Just sit
be
there
right.
and look pretty, Denny. That's all you really need to do.
This is Milwaukee Maps. This is our outward-facing mapping system on zoning. And I went into that map system and I clicked on floodplains and I clicked on habitat conservation area. So the purple are the floodplains, and the collection of yellow lines and crosshatch are habitat conservation area. So for the most part, plain and habitat conservation area align. And again, that was one of the thoughts we had about an option, is perhaps we can use this mechanism to achieve some of that protection that we're looking for. I don't know what the best solution is. I really don't. I don't have a recommendation for you. And I think it's more or less, we probably at this point want to pursue more than one approach to just find more information about how to best do this. But this is one of the options that we have before us. I wanted to just drag up into the industrial area. So in the industrial area, it's narrower because it's all developed.
And the creek is channelized.
Yeah. And the creek's more channelized, that's true. And up in the, and that same thing is true up along Johnson Creek Boulevard, where you have large parking lots for the precision cast parts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I've got. Councilor Beatty had asked a question about matching these things up, so they're close.
I'm not sure I understood what you're proposing with this map, but I guess one question I had is, didn't we, in the NMIA plan, didn't we establish a 50-foot buffer? Is anything, I mean, haven't we already done what might be a taking here? I guess, yeah, I'd like your thoughts on that.
A 50-foot buffer doesn't necessarily cover the entire floodplain. But I think that was primarily done for our natural resource protection, trying to create more of a riparian buffer along Johnson Creek. There's multiple objectives we're trying to get at here, one being floodplain protection, one being restoring that riparian buffer to some degree, and balancing
Okay, can you
development.
explain what the purple is on the map again?
It's the 100-year floodplain.
Is the 100-year floodplain?
Yeah.
And how is the HCA, I thought you said that they were overlaid or something.
Well, they are where it's not already developed. You know, they match up pretty well when you've got, when you don't have pavement. Where there's pavement all along, up through that area,
So how
we're
do we,
excluded.
so say Precision Cast Parts decided that they wanted to do something different with parking. I don't know, they built a 5-story parking garage for some bizarre reason. We don't really have a mechanism in place right now to take advantage of that opportunity to do some floodplain restoration or to incentivize some floodplain restoration.
Well, they would have to do a cut and fill for that. So, you know, so whatever fill they're putting in the floodplain, they'd have to do the corresponding cut.
Sure, yeah, no, I'm thinking of the large swath of floodplain that is currently paved.
Right.
And how do we depave some of that should this unlikely event occur? Because it's no longer, rightfully so, it's not a habitat anymore, so it's not a habitat conservation.
Right, except for right along the creek.
Right, except where there's that little buffer. You see what I'm trying to
Yes.
get at there? I don't,
Yeah, I mean, I think that could come into play, I suppose, during the floodplain discussion. Does it come into play in terms of the natural resource protection?
Right.
It wouldn't necessarily. So I think our option on its face, you know, needs more work. You know,
Right.
it's not like you can just take the HCA and use it, but we need to explore how to get at that a little bit better.
right, and I wonder if that's a question that the Watershed Council has grappled with already to some degree. I don't know if they would have any thoughts on if there are tools out there that we could use. I mean, I know it's a very unlikely scenario. It just seems like we've got hundreds of acres in the floodplain that are industrial. That changes sometimes. And we would make different choices, I think, today with those properties, knowing what we know now about the impacts that that development has on the watershed.
And this use, I mean, there's not much risk to the
Right.
property other
Sure.
than the flood's going to
Right.
move faster
Don't
through
park
that
your car
area.
there if it's flooding.
Right. It's different than
It's not a big structure or
building a
anything.
residential
Yeah.
structure.
Right,
Yeah.
but the end result of that is when it does flood, you're washing a bunch of oil and brake dust and
Pollutants in general.
antifreeze and all that good stuff into the creek and then the river and then the ocean.
And it's just a non-permeable surface.
Yeah, and that's, so going clear back to the very first sort of question on all of this, there's kind of two parts to it, right? There's one which is thinking about future residents or future building owners, if it's commercial or industrial, and the other one is thinking about the natural services that a healthy floodplain provides, both in the standpoint of habitat, but also, more importantly, in the standpoint of absorbing some of that stormwater so that it doesn't all end up in somebody else's yard or property or whatever,
Right.
because we continue to pave the world.
I mean, we just heard testimony from Nickwick about that very issue and about how we're at this precipitous threshold of having 40% or so paved and the very real watershed impacts that has just in terms of water quality and storm runoff. And we know that's only going to get worse. We already have intensifying rainstorms, et cetera, so on and so forth.
Exactly. And I know.
One question, I think sort of we made a commitment to DLCD to try to have the Title 18 amendments that they help support and pay for, done by, I think we might have said June 30th, I can't recall. But so we've made some commitment to bring that stuff forward, and we're ready to bring it forward, but I was like, how do we deal with this other policy issue about it? Those code requirements to comply with FEMA don't go as far as the city wanted to go. Do we do it in 2 stages? Do we work harder at trying to pump up the protections in the code? We are going to have a much more extensive conversation with folks if we're implementing the policy as written.
I guess I don't feel like I have a clear understanding of what the risk of triggering takings really is with this.
Millions of dollars.
It's a lot more than that. I mean, the commercial areas, the industrial areas, it's
It's a big deal.
bankrupt the city. So we actually need to have a very serious conversation about
Yeah.
this.
Okay.
This is a serious.
Counselor Heisey, can I just get a clarification too to what you said? Are you looking for what the tipping point is, or are you looking for why? I mean, I think that yes,
Yeah,
we have a
maybe.
real problem, but I do think that there's a tipping point where in some of the parcels, it's a partial takings versus a
Right.
full takings. I think there's a
Right.
bunch of discussions in there too.
And I think that was just getting back to Counselor Beatty. I remember having a conversation about, because we were talking about having maybe a 150-foot cushion and a buffer, and we were saying, no, that gets us into takings.
Right.
At 50, we weren't there.
Right.
So I think that there are things maybe we can do to keep us short of takings that I would be very happy to see
Right.
staff come back with.
Right.
I mean, I think that,
I'm really concerned.
I hope the question, I think the first question we need to answer is, are we comfortable with takings? And I think, but that's,
I don't think it's that simple.
With it,
I don't think it's a yes or no question. I think it's the nuance. I think there's worse. So, for example, right, if there's a residential property and then somebody can put 2 houses on there, and therefore their maximum profit that they can make off of that is $500,000. It's a really amazing piece of property. And we know it's going to flood, and it right now is a natural area that is doing all the things that a floodplain should do during a flood. It's absorbing those floodwaters, as opposed to telling whoever in the industrial area that their new building that's a $100 million building, they can't build, right? There's nuance. There's orders of levels. I don't think it should be a yes or no.
It's an individual analysis for every property.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So whether it's one residential unit or a $100 million industrial complex, you really have to look to see whether the regulation takes away the development potential with their investment-backed expectations, and particularly now in this post-Measure 49 era,
Right.
when we do new regulations that take away investment-backed expectations for somebody's property, you get into some hot water. So it's really hard to cast a net and say, we're okay with this, because it's not going to get us into takings, because it could very well be a taking on a particular parcel. You'd have to analyze the impact on every parcel.
Yeah.
There's also a little bit of, just to outline my concern on even a $500,000 parcel, that's a parcel that we didn't budget for. So in order to come up with $500,000, it's also a court case. So there's just a bunch of things that do tie up to it that I would be cautious of having us make a decision in land use that leads to us then in court. We could proactively have discussions about whether or not the council would want to go after parcels that are currently in the floodplain and try and purchase parcels, but that's a different strategy. So I did also just want to put that forward.
Yeah, whether or not it's a taking doesn't preclude somebody from receiving a claim that it's a taking, which puts you into a court situation, and there's no attorney fee provisions that provide for the loser to pay the other side's attorney fees. I had another thought that just escaped me.
So can I ask, I do think the industrial area is probably a harder discussion because of the, existing level of development and everything else. But when it comes to residential areas, is a rule fixing our minimum density calculation a better tool? And if we just said that HCA and WQR were exempt from the minimum density calculation, would that be a better, sort of a more elegant solution? And where would that fall on the takings, sort of continuum?
You do that?
Well, I don't know that it would. By taking away minimum density, you're not taking away
The value.
you're not taking away somebody's ability to apply for it, but what the minimum density sort of forces us into a situation of allowing a certain amount of
Making
density.
them, not just allowing.
Yeah.
Making them build.
Right. And going through and to not do it, you have to go through a variance process. I mean, that's what the Elk Rock Estates folks are going to have to do with their application now.
So I do think there's some value in Lisa's idea that at least gets us a little bit of something.
And I don't think it has that great of an impact on our buildable land supply to do that. I mean, there just aren't that many properties that are affected.
I mean, there's a fair number of lots that are an acre or better along the creek
Yeah.
that I can see, that if we applied our minimum density to them, they'd have to put
I guess
six,
what I'm saying, though, is that
whatever.
I don't think they show up as buildable lands in the inventory work that we did. For example, the Elk Rock Estates property, in the calculations, it only produced one additional unit. So we'd have to go back and look at every one of the sites that we had in our buildable lands calculations, but I don't think they generated a lot of additional development, in terms of capacity.
Well, wasn't that I don't pretend to know the whole history of that, but wasn't that a changed calculation later in the process? Weren't they beginning that process with an understanding of a 12 or 11 or something minimum density? That the minimum and the maximum were the same?
Yeah, I was talking generally about the housing needs analysis work that we did. So what I was saying is that these properties don't provide cumulatively that many additional units to the community when you're looking at all the opportunities for infill in the city. As opposed to the point that you were just making is there was some confusion at the beginning by the realtor about how many units one could build on this property. But in fact, it ends up being a pretty low density when you look at that entire site, spread over the entire site.
So that inventory that was done for the H&A, that was under the existing code, the existing zoning, and so I guess...
No, it was just an assumption.
Just an assumption
Just an
based
assumption
on...
in the H&A, yeah.
Okay, so it really wasn't looking at individual lots and what the...
It looked at individual lots. What it didn't do was look at the minimum density allowed on individual lots. It just basically took them out of the base calculation.
Minimum density is not an allowance, it's a requirement.
No, I know that, but an H&A work isn't a science either. It's a bit of an art. So what we do when we build a set of assumptions when we go into the H&A process, and we say, why, basically sort of a hopefully, we're not building on these properties that have risks. So we take them out of the.
Right, but that's us, and that's theoretical, and that's thinking about housing needs as opposed to a developer looking at it with dollar signs in their eyes.
Right.
It's a completely different viewpoint. When they're looking at a piece of property and they say, how can I maximize my profits on that property? Mm-hmm. And then we give them an extra tool of saying, and you're required to put 14 houses on that piece of property instead of the 6 that would make sense to preserve some of the trees.
Well, I was going to say, we have had a couple of properties, a couple of applications in the last few years where the HNA, I mean, the minimum density calculation made somebody think they had to build more than they actually wanted to build when they first came into it. So it's not necessarily all about greed.
We have a perfect opportunity to address this over the next year with our looking at our housing needs, our House Bill 2001 work, and because we're matching that with the tree protection work, I think that we can have this conversation about whether or not we need to, whether or not there's a way to get out of applying minimum densities to these types of situations.
Which would be great. Then the next step is, I guess, the simple question is there no way to create code where you are talking about life safety or something that trumps takings?
Have you been to America?
Trump's America?
Mayor, I think it's a fair question. I guess I think that it's one that the staff can take back and think about right now. I don't have an answer for you today.
I think for purposes of today's discussion, this is kind of the 30,000-foot discussion.
Yeah.
We kind of understand what council's direction and what your desires are. We have to go back and really analyze the current state of Oregon law with regards to these sorts of things and what we can do. And I think the purpose for Denny's presentation is to lay out some things that we've been kicking around in our heads that have been informed from some recent applications. Also knowing your desires, and that we got to bake them a little bit more. We're still mixing the bag.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question that might maybe a little lower than 30,000, but I still want to sort of get at it. We on the option 2, modify draft policies, and the example given was raise floor levels more than 2 feet, and I'm just wondering, if there's rather than talking about reducing or getting rid of the minimums, are there other ways that we can provide for the life and safety? I mean, you look at places that are, places that are built on, waterways where they're built on piers, that's not a taking because you're still allowed to build there. You can still reach your minimum density.
Sure.
I'm not interested in removing from our inventory. I think that we still, need to do this balance, right? But obviously, we don't want anybody, getting hurt in a flood or someone's, neighbor's property getting damaged in a flood because of development either. So I guess I'm wondering if that's the only, I mean, that to me, that's not a very good example because as the mayor said earlier, it doesn't really get at the, it still displaces water that then goes onto, but there are other ways to not displace as much water. And so I'm just wondering, if that might be another thing that staff could look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think for that piece, that half of the equation, yeah, the houses on stilts and floodplains, sure, it doesn't, as you pointed out, solve the problem of you're, in essence, paving more area that by natural design would absorb floodwaters. and therefore those floodwaters are going to go somewhere.
I understand your point. I mean, I think it diverts less. It also potentially, well, no, of course it does. I mean, less than
Unless they
the,
put concrete underneath their piered house so that they can park their car, then you have diverted just exactly as much.
well, right, but I'm saying, like, I mean, but then that wouldn't count necessarily, like, we could have other
Other mitigating
code that would
right.
require that not be permitted. What I'm saying is, we do have this takings issue we can't ignore. And, unless the city is prepared to buy every one of those properties, we need to take that seriously. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the goal for any rewrite would be to have a good, strong, enforceable policy that we are able to put into place, with informed knowledge that we can actually make it work.
yeah.
I don't think putting a policy in place that's going to result in a bunch of takings that we're not going to be able to afford.
We can't resolve them.
Right.
Doesn't do us
Right.
any good. That's why I use the metaphor of baking. We really
Yeah.
need to figure out, there's a lot of pieces to something like that.
Well, and then, because then we get into, land use applications and hearings where we're referring to one thing in our policy that aren't supported by,
Code.
well, not just by code, but, by case law. So, it makes no sense to me to write policy that isn't supported by law. I mean, it's wishful thinking. It's,
Yeah.
Aspirational, but there's a
but it presents problems too. I mean, beyond that, it actually creates problems in our administration of our own laws.
Well, and now I'm thinking about, is this an opportunity to do something in code that, and you mentioned this earlier, Denny, but what is the intersection with our aspirations around our urban forest and carbon sequestration goals that we might be able to put into code when you are building in a floodplain? Maybe you are required to plant specific trees and specific shrubs and to maintain them for 3 years to make sure that they have gotten well established. And, there may be opportunities embedded in this that are get us what we need and want in a couple of different places rather than creating problems that we don't want.
Yeah.
Right, so I'm going to spin out a scenario here and I think that's a great idea. We just went through a process over the last, whatever it was, year and a half, being involved in the purchase of a property up on Kellogg Creek that flooded, that did have flood insurance, and therefore FEMA was willing to pay to buy that piece of property, and we will be now turning that piece of property into a natural area, correct? Mm-hmm. That's today. That's 2018 flood levels. As the storms become more severe, and as there's more of them around the country, and as there's more Houstons happening, and Miami's going underwater, and places like that, FEMA is not going to have any money. Eventually, at some point, there is not an unlimited supply of FEMA money to fix all of this. Mm-hmm. What I'm attempting to do is prefetch that, is to try and have the least number of those problems be built when we already know that it's going to happen, right? If it already exists and it was there for 50 years and nobody knew climate change was coming, that's one question. If today we're saying, yeah, sure, go ahead and build in a place where we know damn good and well it's going to flood in 20 years severely, and the property's going to be destroyed, and theoretically FEMA will have to buy it out, and, oh, by the way, they're not going to have any money. It would be really nice, and this is obviously not just a Milwaukee question, this should be a everywhere question, to stop doing stupid things that we're then going to have to deal with. I mean, they're talking about it in the coastal states. They're talking about not allowing any more development in certain areas that are destroyed by storms repeatedly, or not allowing people to rebuild again in the same place. Those conversations are beginning to happen. So what I'm encouraging is that we also have those conversations, because, we sit between two creeks and next to a very, very large tidal-based river that are going to be affected in the coming years. And to the greatest degree possible, not allowing or somehow discouraging or somehow causing more development that in 30 years, people are going to look back and go, that was stupid. Why didn't anybody let them do that? So we know it's coming. So to stand here and say, well, yeah, but the current law makes us do stupid things.
No,
I don't
hold on.
think it's a good excuse.
I'm going to interject because I want to make sure that you're not mischaracterizing what I'm saying, which is not go ahead and build and let people die in the floodplain. So just start there, that we are all on the same page here. And my point is that we do need to act within what is actually legal. We can't just make up rules that are going to get, we can't do that. So what I'm suggesting is that there are maybe other paths toward the same goal of discouraging or mitigating or preventing stupid things from happening that don't also land us in court.
Right.
And what if there's, now I'm just pulling all sorts of wacky ideas out of the ether, but what if you are building in the floodplain, you are required to make a payment into some sort of fund that is not FEMA, because we know FEMA is going to break, but is something that the city manages, and then we've got another tool for when those people eventually do potentially lose their homes, we can pay for temporary housing for them, or I don't know. But creativity in those general directions seems like a good thing to explore.
So go for it, Denny.
I wanted to ask a question sort of based on all of this discussion. And it's partly because I'd really like to fix what we can in Title 18 without maybe solving every problem. So I'm suggesting that we maybe do a little bit of crafting to the current policy to put in some aspirational language about exploring ways to increase and look at ways to restrict development, and then adopt the Title 18 proposal that we've got, and then as we move into the next phase of this work, that we're very conscious and we're approaching this conflict through the implementation component of the code. So it would basically be touching floodplains twice, probably, but we'll get all the easy stuff cleared up right now and then have to deal with this bigger question as we're dealing with housing, as we're dealing with tree protection.
Is there some, just because there was grant money associated with the rewrite of 18, is there some requirement that, are we going to lose the money if we don't do something?
It's done.
Okay.
It was money that DLCD got from FEMA. They then approached us. We said, sure, we'll take your help. But they had some commitments that they made to FEMA about completing these upgrades to the codes. So if we
fail to
if we
fulfill
fail,
that
I mean,
that's my question.
it's just we look bad in DLCD's eyes next time they want to help us with something.
So if we, I guess my thinking is that I guess I'm not a big fan of delaying the pain or delaying the hard decisions. I think when the stuff we're going to go through in the next year, year and a half, whatever it takes, there's going to be a lot of other hard decisions, and there's going to be a lot of other things that might generate more concern or opposition or whatever, and dealing with this as a finite issue or as a discrete issue with limited reach, it seems to me is maybe less likely to get the attention and the legal challenge than something that comes as part of a bigger package of regulation. Any thoughts on that from our lawyer or from Denny?
Well, I was just thinking I was thinking it would be nice to tie this back into some of the natural resource and tree protection, because they would sort of complement each other. I mean, I was really intrigued by some of the discussion that talked about the amount of mitigation that one might be required to do if you were developing in the floodplain, and how we would make that balance.
That's a good idea.
Which makes it part of that bigger project, not just not something that we could complete in the next 4 or 5 months.
So, Justin, is challenging a taking something that you have a finite amount of time to do? It has to be done within a year or whatever of the
days.
Code change, or is it something that somebody can do 10 years later when they come around to redeveloping their property?
Well, I mean, there might be some time restrictions on a facial challenge, but an as-applied challenge can come when the when the taking is affected. So, I mean, this piece of property could change hands several times, and then when somebody comes in to try to develop it, and we impose a regulation, apply a regulation on their property that, in their estimation, affects a taking, they could challenge the regulation at that time.
Wouldn't it be if they bought the property with the regulation in place that?
Yeah,
they
there's
accept
some
that?
things we need to look into in terms of timing in the post-3749 world. But I think a challenge is not limited to 120 days after the passage of the regulation.
Right.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect it to
But
be.
it would seem like in the changing of hands that it would at least lessen it. Because
It might.
then it was in place when you just made the decision to buy.
We would have to look at the post-3749 stuff.
Yeah, how about we just find out? That would be good to know.
So I just have one question. We're at time, so I do want to call it in 3 minutes. But I guess my question to Denny is whether or not we have what we need for the language for the comp plan, because this has been
Right.
a good broad conversation, but we have to be done with that document.
I mean, if everybody's on board with this idea of trying to shift the policy to a little more aspirational language and then move the Title 18 stuff forward with the understanding that we're going to get serious about this as we do the housing and tree code work. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
I think that helps.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks, Denny.
Good job, everyone. With that, we are adjourned for the work session. We will be back for the regular session in a half hour.
Okay. Man, I feel like I'm coming down with a cold or